The splintering pry bar was the only sound under the oppressive blanket of heat. It was a sound of violation, of entry into a space sealed by decades of dust and neglect. Ilara put her weight into the iron, her thin arms corded with a wiry strength that surprised most people. The old pine board groaned, its nails shrieking as they surrendered their hold on the joist below. A puff of fine, pale dust, smelling of ancient decay and long-dead mice, billowed into the stagnant air of the main room. Beside her, an old dog with a coat the color of that same dust lifted his head, his brown eyes watching her with infinite patience. He sneezed once, a soft foot, then rested his grizzled muzzle back on his paws. Ilara had paid $4 for the deed to the old Thorn way station. The clerk in the territorial office had laughed, a wheezing, tobacco-stained chuckle. $4 for 90 acres of sun-blasted rock and a building that the wind was actively trying to dismantle. He'd stamped the paper with a flourish, as if commemorating her foolishness for posterity. But Ilara had seen the bones of the place, good bones. The foundation was stone, deep and square. The main timbers were desert cypress, hard as iron and ignored by the termites that had turned so many other homesteads to powder. It was the rest of it that was confounding. The impossibly steep pitch of the collapsed roof, the strangely narrow windows, the thick, crumbling adobe walls embedded with what looked like ceramic cones. It was a place built against something, but no one remembered what. She worked the board free and set it aside, peering into the dark space beneath the floor. More dust, the skeletal remains of a pack rat's nest, and something else. A dark shape wrapped in oilskin, tucked neatly between two joists. She reached into the cool, spider-webbed dark, her fingers closing around the stiff, waxy bundle. It was heavy, solid. She pulled it out into the slanted afternoon light and laid it on the floor. Dust padded over, sniffing at the strange object before looking up at her, his tail giving a single, inquisitive thump against the floorboards. Carefully, Ilara untied the brittle leather thong holding the package together. The oilskin, cracked and stiff with age, flaked away to reveal 3 thick, leather-bound journals. The covers were blank, but when she opened the first one, the inside page bore a single name in elegant faded ink. Silas Thorne, 1878. The man who had built this place. She ran a thumb over the name. It felt like a handshake across a century of silence. For the next 3 days, she did not lift a hammer. She sat on the porch as the sun rose and fell, dust at her feet, and read. The first journal was a record of construction, filled with precise measurements and strange calculations. The second was a study of the sky, of weather patterns so unusual she had to read the passages multiple times. Silas wrote of winds that came from the wrong direction, of a stillness that felt heavier than sound, and of clouds the color of a fresh bruise. He called it the skyfall. A cyclical storm, he theorized, one that came perhaps once in a man's lifetime, but when it came, it did not bring rain. It brought ice, hard and heavy enough to punch through a wagon bed, to kill a horse where it stood. The third journal was the key. It was a synthesis of the first 2, explaining his methods, his madness. The roof must not offer purchase, he wrote. It must be a cliff, not a shelf. An angle of 60 degrees, so the ice strikes a glancing blow and shatters on the granite I have laid below. It is a roof designed not to hold the sky up, but to cast it off. The windows must be small, to present a lesser target. The shutters must be of 3-inch thick laminated timber, interlocking, so that no single board bears the full force of a strike. They are not to keep out men, but to repel artillery from God. The walls must breathe. The pressure of such a storm, the sudden drop, can collapse a sealed structure from the inside out. The ceramic funnels I have fired and embedded are pressure equalizers. They will howl like banshees when the front arrives, a warning and a release valve in one. Ilara closed the final journal as dusk settled, turning the sky to a soft violet. She looked at the ruined station, at the sagging roofline and the gaping window holes. It wasn't a ruin. It was a blueprint. It was a set of instructions left by a man who had listened to the quiet, terrible language of the land. She had a plan. Her first trip to the settlement for supplies was met with a mixture of pity and amusement. When she ordered the lumber, twice the amount anyone would need for a roof that size, the mill owner, Mr. Henderson, squinted at her list. "This is enough wood for 2 roofs, little lady," he said, wiping sawdust from his hands onto his leather apron. "I know," Ilara said. "I'm laminating the beams myself." He just shook his head and tallied the cost. It took nearly all of her remaining money. As she was loading the wagon, an older man on a fine-looking bay horse rode up. He was Jedediah Croft, the territory's most successful rancher, a man whose opinions were as solid and unmovable as the mesas that defined the horizon. "Heard someone bought the old Thorn Folly," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't unkind, but his eyes held the easy certainty of a man who had never been proven wrong about anything important. "Didn't figure it'd be a slip of a girl." "My name is Ilara," she said, not stopping her work. "Jedediah Croft. My spread is just over that rise." He gestured with his chin. "You'll need help with this place. A proper roof for a start. Something that'll hold up to the wind." "I have a plan," she said quietly. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Thorn had a plan too. Ended up with a roof so steep the shingles slid off at every spring. Craziest thing I ever saw. He was a strange one. Left just as sudden as he came." Jedediah looked at the heavy timbers she was loading. "Wait until the first big wind takes that thing clean off. It'll land halfway to my property." Ilara just nodded, securing the last board with a rope. "It'll work," she said, more to herself than to him. She didn't have the words to explain Silas Thorne's calculations, the elegant physics of his desperation. She could only build it. Actions would have to be her argument. The work was a slow, brutal meditation. She rose before the sun, her body aching from the day before, and worked until the light failed. Dust was her shadow, her silent foreman, watching from a patch of shade as she wrestled with the heavy timbers. She built a steam box from scrap metal and an old boiler, softening the wood planks so she could bend them, clamp them, and glue them together with a resin she made from piñon sap and slaked lime. 3 layers for each beam, the grain of each layer opposing the next, creating a single piece of wood that was stronger than the sum of its parts. 14 beams in total, each one a monument to her stubbornness. Getting them into place was the hardest part. She built a gin pole and used a system of ropes and pulleys, with dust often serving as a patient, 4-legged anchor. It was a dangerous, inch-by-inch process. One afternoon, a rope slipped. A half-raised beam, 600 pounds of laminated cypress, swung free. It clipped her on the shoulder, sending her tumbling from the wall scaffold to the hard-packed earth 10 feet below. She lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of her, the world a dizzying smear of blue and brown. Dust was on her in an instant, licking her face, whining with a soft, desperate terror. The pain in her shoulder was a sharp, white fire. She sat up, her vision clearing, and saw the beam dangling, held by a single fraying rope. Her shoulder was dislocated. She could feel the unnatural lump of the bone against her skin. Gritting her teeth, she crawled to the stone wall of the foundation. She looked at Dust. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, her voice tight with pain. Using the unyielding stone as leverage, she slammed her own shoulder back against it. The sound was a wet, sickening pop, and the pain was so immense that she blacked out for a second. When she came to, the arm was weak and trembling, but the joint was back in place. She tore a strip from her shirt to make a sling. Then, slowly, painstakingly, she climbed back up the scaffold and secured the beam before the last rope gave way. That night, she tended to her bruised body, stitching a cut on her arm with a needle she sterilized in the fire. She worked more slowly for the next week, her body a constant, throbbing ache, but she did not stop. Martha Croft, Jedediah's wife, started visiting once a week. She was a kind woman with worried eyes, and she would bring a fresh-baked loaf of bread or a stew. She would watch Ilara heaving timbers into place or mixing adobe for the walls, and she would cluck her tongue. "It's not right, a young girl doing this kind of work alone," she'd say. Jedediah could send a couple of his hands over. They could have a proper roof on this place in 2 days. "This is the proper roof," Ilara would reply, her voice gentle but firm. "But dear, it's so steep. And those shutters, they look like something for a fortress." "They are." Martha would sigh and leave the food, convinced the girl was touched by grief or loneliness. The whole settlement was talking about her now. Ilara's Echo, they called the station, a folly built upon a folly. Mayor Thompson, a man whose wealth came from selling sensible things to sensible people, declared her a cautionary tale for Eastern investors. One day, a young man named Ben arrived, his wagon loaded with the custom-cut shutters she'd ordered from a mill 2 territories over. He was different from the others. He didn't stare at the strange, skeletal framework of the roof with mockery. He looked at it with an engineer's curiosity. "Never seen a pitch like that on a house," he said, unloading the first heavy shutter. He was lean and tanned, with quiet, observant eyes. "It's for shedding," Ilara said, checking the joints. They were perfect. "Shedding snow?" He squinted at the sun-baked landscape. "We don't get that kind of snow here." "Not snow." He didn't press her. He just nodded and helped her unload the rest. The shutters were 3 inches thick, made of interlocking oak planks with a channel cut into the edges. When 2 were put together, they formed a nearly seamless wall of wood. He stayed to help her hang the first one, his movements efficient and sure. They worked in a comfortable silence, the scrape of wood and the clang of iron hardware the only sounds between them. "This is a lot of work," he said when the first shutter was seated in its heavy iron frame. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her, then at her bandaged arm and the dark bruises peeking out from her sleeve. "You need a hand with the rest of this." It wasn't a question. "I can't pay much." "Pay me in coffee and whatever Mrs. Croft brings you," he said with a slight smile. "And answers, eventually." Ben stayed. He was a freighter by trade, but he found himself delaying his next route, drawn in by the quiet intensity of Ilara's project. He learned to mix adobe to Silas Thorne's specific recipe, with more straw and crushed granite than was traditional, creating a wall that was less likely to crack under impact. He helped her hoist the final roof beams and nail down the tongue and groove decking. He never questioned the design, not once. He just watched her consult the worn journals in the evenings and trusted the certainty he saw in her eyes. They were laying the final course of roofing tiles, heavy, interlocking slate that she'd salvaged from a collapsed mine, when a summer squall blew in. It was a typical desert storm, a sudden violence of wind and rain that was over in 20 minutes. But it was enough. The wind caught the edge of an unsecured section of the roof, peeling back a 10-foot square of slate and decking as if it were paper. The wreckage crashed to the ground. Jedediah Croft rode over the next morning, his expression a mixture of concern and vindication. "Saw that from my porch," he said, gesturing to the hole. "Told you. A roof that steep it acts like a sail. A real wind, a winter gale, will tear the whole thing off." Ilara looked at the damage, her face smudged with dirt. "The nails were too short," she said, "and I didn't finish the flashing. It's my mistake." "It's the design, girl. It's just wrong." "No," she said, her voice low and certain. "The design is right. My work was wrong." Jedediah shook his head and rode off. Ben watched him go, then turned to Ilara. "He's not trying to be cruel. He just sees the world the way it's always been." "I know," she said, already prying up the damaged boards. "But the world isn't always what it's been." They repaired the roof, this time using longer, hand-forged nails and bolting the decking directly to the laminated beams. They sealed the edges with thick copper flashing. It took them another 2 weeks, but when they were done, the roof was a single, monolithic shield of slate and wood. They finished the last of the shutters, installed a lightning rod system exactly as Silas had drawn it, and cleaned the strange, hollow ceramic funnels embedded in the walls until they were clear of a century of debris. As autumn deepened, the work was finally done. The Thorn way station stood complete, a bizarre architectural statement on the flat plain. Its 60-degree roof sliced at the sky. Its narrow windows were hidden behind fortress-like shutters. Its walls bristled with the odd horn-shaped funnels. It looked less like a home and more like an instrument, built to measure some terrible, unknown force. The mockery from the community softened into a kind of resigned pity. The poor girl had finished her folly. Now she just had to live in it. Ilara, Ben, and Dust settled into a quiet routine. The station was dark and cool inside, the thick walls and small windows keeping the worst of the sun at bay. It was peaceful. But Ilara never stopped watching the sky. She read Silas's weather journal every night, comparing his observations to the clouds, the wind, the quality of the light. The change began in late November. The air grew still, unnaturally so. The usual winds that scoured the plains died completely, and a strange, heavy silence fell over the land. The sky, which should have been a clear crystalline blue, took on a bruised, yellowish-green tint. The horizon blurred. Dust grew restless. The old dog, who usually spent his days sleeping in sunbeams, began to pace. He would stand at the door, a low whine rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the strange, discolored sky. He refused to go far from the station, staying close to Ilara's side, nudging her hand with his nose for reassurance. "He feels it," Ben said one evening, watching the dog. "The pressure is dropping. I can feel it in my ears." Ilara nodded, her gaze distant. She walked to the west-facing wall and placed her hand against one of the ceramic funnels. It was cool to the touch and silent. She remembered Silas's words, "They will howl like banshees when the front arrives." The next day the humming started. It was almost too low to hear at first, a faint vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. But it grew steadily, a rising, resonant tone that emanated from the ceramic funnels. It was a single, pure note, and it filled the air with a sense of profound and terrible expectation. The sound made the hairs on their arms stand up. It was the sound of the world holding its breath. In the settlement, people looked up at the sickly sky, unnerved by the silence and the strange color. Jedediah Croft stood on his porch, a lifetime of weather knowledge telling him something was deeply wrong. This was no thunderstorm. This was no winter blizzard. This was something other. By midday, the humming from the funnels had risen in pitch to a distinct, mournful moan. It was loud enough now to be heard 100 yards from the station. Ilara and Ben worked quickly, their movements precise and economical. They brought the pack animals into the reinforced stable, a low, stone building connected to the main house. They checked the shutters one last time, ensuring every iron bolt was thrown. They lit the lanterns in the windowless main room, plunging the station into a premature twilight. Dust huddled at Ilara's feet, shivering despite the warmth. The moan of the funnels suddenly rose to a piercing shriek. It was a physical assault, a sound that vibrated in their bones. And then, silence. A total, absolute void of sound that was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. A single, sharp crack echoed through the station, like a rifle shot. Then another, and another. Ilara looked at Ben, her eyes wide in the lantern light. "It's starting," she whispered. She moved to the thick oak door and slid back the small peephole cover. Outside, the world had gone mad. The sky was a churning vortex of black and green, and falling from it were not raindrops, but chunks of ice. The first ones were small, the size of marbles, clattering against the slate roof. But they grew larger with astonishing speed. Golf balls, baseballs. They struck the ground with heavy, wet thuds, cratering the hard-packed earth. The sound on the roof was not a clatter anymore. It was a deafening, percussive roar, a continuous bombardment. It sounded like 1,000 giants with sledgehammers were trying to beat their way in. Yet inside, the great beams held. The sound was terrifying, but nothing splintered, nothing broke. Ilara pressed her eye to the peephole again. A piece of ice the size of a small melon cartwheeled out of the sky and struck one of the oak shutters. The wood shuddered, a deep boom echoing through the room, but it held fast. Another strike, and another. The fortress was holding. The design was working. Silas Thorne's impossible theories were being proven in a crucible of frozen fury. Through the roar, she heard another sound, a desperate shouting. She peered out again and saw a wagon, its canvas top shredded to ribbons, careening toward them. One of the horses was limping badly, its head bleeding. Jedediah Croft was at the reins, whipping the terrified animals, while Martha huddled beside him, trying to shield her head with a saddle blanket. Ben was already at the stable door. "Get them in!" Ilara yelled over the din. They unbolted the heavy stable doors just as the wagons skidded to a halt. The hailstones were bigger now, jagged and cruel. One struck the wagon bed and punched clean through the wood. Ben and Ilara grabbed the Crofts, pulling them from the wagon and shoving them into the relative safety of the stable. A grapefruit-sized chunk of ice slammed into the ground where Jedediah had been standing a second before. He stared at the crater it left, his face pale with shock. His prize-winning bay horse, the one he'd ridden to the station months ago, screamed as a piece of ice struck its leg with a sickening crack of bone. "The animals!" Jedediah cried, his voice breaking. There was no time. The stable doors were slammed shut and bolted. The horse's screaming was cut short by a final percussive thud. Inside the stone-walled stable, the roar of the storm was slightly muffled. Martha Croft was sobbing, her face buried in her husband's chest. Jedediah just stared, his eyes vacant. Everything he owned, his herds, his barns, his home, it was all out there, under the sky's relentless artillery. More people came. The mayor, his fine carriage splintered and useless. The blacksmith and his family, who had been caught on the road. A dozen people in all, staggering out of the maelstrom, their faces cut and bruised by the ice. They were guided to the station by the sheer impossibility of its existence. the one dark, solid shape that was not being beaten into the ground. Ilara and Ben led them from the stable through a short, stone-lined tunnel into the main station, and then down a set of steep stairs into the cavernous cistern room Silas had dug beneath the foundation. It was deep, dry, and silent, the roar of the storm above them reduced to a distant, angry rumble. They huddled in the dark, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. They were a cross-section of the community that had mocked her, now sheltered within the heart of her folly. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They just listened to the muffled sounds of their world being destroyed above them, and were grateful for the madman and the stubborn girl who had built a shelter against a storm no one else believed was coming. The storm raged for nearly an hour. The roaring bombardment finally lessened, replaced by the sound of smaller, pebble-sized hail, and then, finally, an eerie silence broken only by the dripping of water. After another 20 minutes of quiet, Ben unbolted the door and pushed it open. The world was white. As far as the eye could see, the ground was covered in a thick, churning layer of ice, some pieces still shockingly large. The air was frigid, stripped of all its warmth. The sun broke through the strange, retreating clouds, and the light that reflected off the landscape of shattered ice was blinding. Every tree was stripped bare, their branches broken and mangled. In the distance, where the settlement should have been, there were only the splintered remains of buildings. Jedediah Croft's fine, sturdy barn was a pile of kindling. The roof of the mayor's house had been punched through like it was tissue paper. The land was scoured, pulverized, remade. But the station stood. Its slate roof was scarred and pitted, but intact. The thick oak shutters were dented and splintered, but unbroken. The ground around the foundation was piled high with shattered ice, a testament to the glancing angle of the roof. Silas Thorne's fortress had held. Slowly, the others emerged from the darkness of the cistern, blinking in the painful light. They looked at the devastation, at the ruins of their homes and their livelihoods. Then they looked at the station. And then they looked at Ilara. Jedediah Croft walked over to her. He was a man broken, all his certainty washed away. He looked at the roof, then at the sturdy walls, then back at the young woman he had dismissed as a fool. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Finally, he found his voice, a raw, hoarse whisper. I was wrong, he said. I'm sorry. It was an admission that cost him the world, and in the quiet of the ruined morning, it was the only apology that mattered. Ilara simply nodded. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, weary sadness for all that had been lost. We should see who else needs help, she said, her voice practical, pulling them back from the edge of despair. There was work to do. In the days that followed, the Thorne Way Station became the heart of the territory. It was a hospital, a command center, and a shelter. Its pantry was stocked, its well was deep, and its walls were whole. The survivors, which by some miracle was nearly everyone, worked together with a grim, focused energy. Ilara's quiet competence became their anchor. She knew how to splint a broken bone, how to ration food, how to organize work crews. And Ben was there beside her, his steady presence a constant source of strength. The knowledge in Silas Thorne's journals, once the source of mockery, became their scripture of survival. When the time came to rebuild, it was not the old, vulnerable structures they razed. It was the way station that became the model. Jedediah Croft, his own ranch a total loss, was the first to ask for her help. "Teach me," he said, his hands, calloused from a lifetime of roping cattle, now clumsy with a builder's pencil. Teach me how to build it right. Ilara brought out the journals. She didn't lecture or boast. She simply opened the books on the large table in the main room and shared the knowledge. She explained the physics of the roof, the necessity of the pressure funnels, the interlocking strength of the shutters. The men and women who had called her a fool now listened with the rapt attention of students. They learned to laminate beams, to mix the stone and straw adobe, to fire the ceramic cones in a makeshift kiln. The territory was rebuilt with steeper roofs and stronger walls. The new settlement looked different, angled and fortified, a community shaped by a shared catastrophe and a newfound respect for the quiet, unconventional wisdom it had once scorned. The station was no longer Ilara's echo. It was simply the station, the center of their new world. Years passed. The scars on the landscape slowly healed. New trees grew, their branches reaching for the sky with a little more caution than their predecessors. Ilara and Ben married, their vows spoken quietly on the porch of the station, witnessed by the Crofts and the other families they had saved. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up understanding that the strange humming of the funnels was not something to be feared, but something to be heeded. The station became a home, a true way station, a place of learning where the story of the skyfall was told to every new generation, a lesson in humility and preparation. Dust grew old. His grizzled muzzle turned white, his movements slow and deliberate. He spent his final years sleeping in the sun that streamed through the open door, his body a familiar, comforting weight against Ilara's feet in the evenings. He had been her first believer, her steadfast companion through the lonely months of labor and doubt. One autumn morning, Ilara found him lying peacefully under the mesquite tree that had somehow survived the great storm. He had not cried out. He had simply gone to sleep and not woken up. His passing was quiet, dignified, a gentle closing of a chapter. Ilara and Ben buried him there, beneath the tree's shade. There was no marker, but Ilara knew she would never forget the spot. His absence was a quiet ache, a hollow space in the home he had helped her build. More years passed, decades. Ilara's hair turned the color of winter frost. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, were a map of a life of hard, meaningful work. Ben passed first, his heart giving out one peaceful evening as he sat reading Silas's journals for the 100th time. Ilara mourned him with the same quiet strength she had brought to everything else. She continued on, the matriarch of the territory, her mind as sharp as ever. She taught her grandchildren how to read the sky, how to listen to the wind, how to respect the knowledge of those who came before. She was 87 when she died in her sleep, in the same bed she had shared with Ben for over 60 years. The entire territory came to pay their respects. They did not weep with abandon, for hers had been a long and complete life, but the sense of loss was profound, like a mountain suddenly vanishing from the horizon. They buried her next to Ben, a few feet from the mesquite tree where dust lay. They debated what to put on her grave marker. The mayor suggested a long epitaph, listing her accomplishments, the lives she saved. But Jedediah Croft's grandson, a man with his great-grandfather's steady eyes, silenced him. "She never used a long sentence when a short one would do," he said. He and his brother, both master carpenters, chose a piece of desert cypress, the same wood Silas had used for the station's main timbers. They sanded it smooth and carved the words themselves. The marker was simple, elegant, and strong. It read, "Ilara Thorne. She listened to the quiet knowledge. She built against the storm." Another 50 years passed. The station was a historic monument now, maintained by the community with reverent care. The territory around it was prosperous, its uniquely angled architecture a point of pride. The story of Ilara and the skyfall had become a founding myth, a legend told to children. One afternoon in late autumn, a young girl with Alara's dark, observant eyes was playing near the station. A strange stillness fell over the plains. The sky began to turn a sickly shade of yellow-green, and then she heard it. A low, faint hum, coming from the ceramic funnels embedded in the old station's walls. She was not afraid. She had been taught this sound her whole life. She stood for a moment, listening as the note grew, a mournful, resonant warning. Then she turned and ran, not in panic, but with purpose, toward the settlement. "It's time!" she shouted, her voice clear and strong in the heavy air. "The funnels are singing, 'It's time to go to the station!'" And behind her, the old Thorn Way station stood against the darkening sky, its steep roof a sharp, defiant line, its shutters like closed eyes. It was no longer just a building. It was a promise. A legacy of $4, a set of forgotten journals, and the quiet, stubborn certainty of a woman who had known how to listen. It was a shelter, waiting patiently for the sky to fall again.